So probably you can give us your perspective about BRICS and New Development Bank.
Thank you very much for having me again. Good seeing you also, Jim. First point I'd like to make, and also I want to just maybe frame this around maybe three propositions. The first point is that I think it is early days, Henry, to assess the sort of historical significance of BRICS. I think also it is 20 years since Jim in November 2001 wrote the paper, but it is only actually 12 years since the BRICS leaders and BRICS as we know it today. In 2009, the 5 leaders came together, and it's actually only 6 years since the New Development Bank have been created. So I think it's important to look at it through that historical lens. The 20 years is more the concept that Jim sort of conceptualized have been in vogue, but the institutional formation is much sort of younger. So we're very much at the early stages of its evolution. My proposition is that what BRICS have done is created a platform for what later on could become, or is already the embryo for a more emerging markets platform within these global governance structures. Now, as you know, the G20 was only formed 22, 23 years ago or so, but within the G20, these countries already had, there was an informal sort of network amongst these large emerging markets. Indonesia, maybe Mexico and others were also part of that dialogue. And they were at the forefront of articulating for reform within the World Bank, within the IMF, which led to what is known as Voice Reform 2009, 2010, as Jim just referenced. So the BRICS countries played a much bigger role over this period to help engineer those reforms to make the global governance system more credible, more legitimate, because we do have still today a mismatch between the economic power of the large emerging markets and their political weight as represented within the official structures. So the G7 is obviously, being overtaken by the G20, and it has definitely democratized decision-making in many respects. But let me make the second proposition, and maybe there was a reason why Jim didn't cover this in his article for, I'm sure just because of the length, but there are some significant achievements of the New Development Bank and the institutions that BRICS have created that maybe was not flagged in the article. The first one is that many people don't know that there's another institution that BRICS created. Well, it's a virtual institution. It's called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. And essentially what this is, it's a facility. It's a pooling of foreign exchange reserves of $100 billion, the bulk coming from China, $41 billion from China, 18 from India, 18 from Russia, and so on, and 5 from South Africa. Should any of our 5 countries have balance of payment pressures, Henry, this is a facility. Traditionally, you'd go to the IMF if you have balance of payment liquidity challenges. This is now, this was put in place. Again, the treaty was signed in 2014 already, and not many people know about it because it is a virtual fund. It's a pooling of reserves, and it will play a very important role in the event of a global liquidity crisis. The second key and most significant achievement of BRICS have been the creation of the New Development Bank. This is an institution. It has $50 billion of subscribed capital. It has now approved, up until last week, $31 billion of sustainable infrastructure. The bank have this huge additional sort of symbolically, the fact that it has never financed a coal-fired power station. It has a completely green and sustainable persona, which I think is also very important in this age of climate change that we are living through. So the second point I'd like to make is that New Development Bank is also still at its early stages, but it will also morph and mutate into a more emerging markets bank. You might know a month ago, we admitted United Arab Emirates, Bangladesh, as well as Uruguay, and we're on the cusp of introducing significant new emerging markets over the next number of months and years to come. So it was born, the concept was born in 2001. It sort of, was still a baby by 2015 when the institutions was created. But one has to look at longer historical lenses to assess what potential impact this acronym, which Jim was the creator of, will have on the world.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. I think you're right. I mean, we should be a bit more patient and then give a bit more time. And of course, the BRICS country, I mean, they come along and then they form this new development bank, which is a great achievement, I think. And also now they have done so many, dispersed for the sustainable development, but also you just said they have a big facility also set aside in case that anything needed. So this is a great achievement. I really congratulate. I think that the achievement of new development. But of course, we will have more to come in the future. I'm glad to hear all those other emerging countries are joining the New Development Bank, and they set very good examples of that. I'm sure Jim has a bit high expectations as a creator, but I'm sure you will be pleased to see the bank has done very well. Now I would like actually to change a bit of the subject. Recently we published a book called "Consensus and Conflict," and actually Jim has actually contributed a paper for that, and called "What is the right way to structure global health? The case for radical new organizations and thinking." So thank you, Jim, for your contribution of this paper to the book that myself and Alistair Michu, both of us edited, and it's actually published internationally by Jim talk about Nature, actually by Springer Nature publisher, and then that book has actually already downloaded over 110 and 200,000 already around the world. It's really a great book that has been well received. It's called "Consensus and Conflict: China and the Globalization in the 21st Century," and of course we have you contribute a great piece to that on this read article. It's really great. What is the right way to structure global health, which is a timely subject, and then the case for radical and new organizations. So as you wrote in this article, actually, Jim, you wrote about your experience in leading a group called the Global Review of Antimicrobial Resistance. So AMR investigate the lack of development of new use for antimicrobial and excessive use of antibiotics and its risk and enormous economic cost from the global health threat, which has been also proven by the COVID. So it may be just in time we talk about this, the idea that you have in this book, how the international global health system and how recently the outbreak of Omicron as another variant of COVID virus, and that continue to spread after Delta variant. So what's your, maybe can you elaborate on your concept about this global health reorganization?
Again, thank you, Henry. I'd be delighted to talk about this briefly because it's something I've become very, very passionate about. To make it easier to talk about antimicrobial resistance, which is, even for those of us that, whose natural speaking language is English, it's quite a mouthful. So it often abbreviates to AMR to make it easier.
Yeah.
But I also often say that it's probably intellectually the most interesting thing I've ever done in my life. And I've had a very fortunate professional career, but leading a global independent review into the challenge of AMR was fascinating for many, many reasons, but at the core because of its global importance. And it's often known, particularly in contrast to COVID or because of COVID, as the silent pandemic that is killing as many. My review became, in the world of global health, quite famous for saying that if we don't do something about the problem of antimicrobials, particularly resistance to antibiotics, by 2050, we will end. I can hear. Yeah. If we don't do something about it by 2050, we could have 10 million people a year always dying because antibiotics won't work anymore. And with it, a colossal loss of economic activity. And what is fascinating about the mood now because of this current crisis is those few health specialists that looked at our numbers and occasionally said 5 years ago that maybe they were exaggerated. Actually now they realize that on the contrary, if you don't deal with global health threats, they can be worse than global financial threats. And the last time I looked, the loss of economic activity during COVID in the past 2 years around the world is 3 times worse than that in the financial crisis. And this came from a global health crisis. Which takes me to the second core point of the chapter I had the privilege of writing for your book. And by the way, congratulations to you and Alistair on such very powerful sales so far. And I hope it will become 10 times or 100 times bigger, given its importance. No, seriously, given the importance of the issues. But the central idea is we need to stop treating health as some place in the corner that we only ever focus on when the problem becomes right in the middle of our face. Mm-hmm. And just as the FSB was created to try and anticipate that the global financial system will always have enough capital and it will be ready for the next global financial crisis, we need to do the same thing with health. And the central proposition is to have a global health and finance board under the G20, which would be represented by both finance ministers and health ministers. And in order to do that, we will be able to have a truly effective global surveillance system for health, adequate financing of the WHO instead of this slightly bizarre voluntary-based system. And every week of our lives, take for example, this so-called Omicron variant of COVID we're currently dealing with, and Leslie's country, South Africa, is suffering because of the very rapid decision to impose travel constraints. If we had a proper global health and finance board, we would be prepared to think in advance, all around the world together, how these things should be dealt with before they happen. And by that, it would not stop global health problems, but it would stop them from having the economic and financial damage and the destruction which we're still living through nearly 2 years after the onset of COVID. And I've become very passionate about that. And together with some of the people led by Mario Monti on the commission that I was part of, we are still trying to lobby very extensively for the initiatives introduced to have a task force to look at this under the G20 of Italy's presidency, to have that taken up by the Indonesian presidency, and for this to become a central part of future global policymaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, Jim. Yeah, no, that's really a very important task you're championing, and also has contributed so much to this international global health system. And of course, in our book, actually, we just mentioned this consensus or conflict. You stated that matching WHO's role and responsibility with the global reality is very important. So it is very true that lessons learned from COVID are desperately needed, in terms to transform the reforms of global health governance system. And on Wednesday, just this week, and members of WHO has agreed to set up an intergovernmental body to negotiate a draft of global pandemic treaty. And so do you see a good sign? And so in terms of global health reform system and the global governance on that, where do you see, countries like, BRICS countries, China, European, EU, American, and how we can work together rather than, we have become so political, yes. Driven by different countries or source of the region. I mean, it should be coming, either from nature or animal, but we can have a predetermined. Is a man-made from lab. That really soured the mood to collaborate. So how do you think about we can better collaborate on those issues?
Yeah, I think there are some quite easy wins that could be made, Henry, to be honest. And again, I'm very, very grateful that you give me an opportunity to talk about this, particularly with an audience in China, because China is in a position to take great leadership on this topic, given its importance in itself, but also at the core of the BRICS countries. But I'd say three very easy things need to happen. As I said, there has already been a task force now established following the G20 meeting, and I know that the WHO is in the center of trying to see how to implement two parallel things. How could you practically implement a global health and finance board? And secondly, how can you ensure representative financing of something like global vaccine distribution, or money for new antibiotics, or many other things, but crucially, the financing of the WHO itself. When we stand back from what's going on and look at it from 40,000 feet, the WHO should be financed in the same sort of way that the IMF is, for it to be a voluntary thing, which allows, for example, the brilliant contributions of the Gates Foundation to be a crucial thing for such a centrally important organization for the world. It's crazy. And so we need to get, hopefully under the Indonesian presidency, some agreement to these simple things. And the final thing to say, which I'm describing as simple, but this part of it is going to have to emerge through time. I think involving the private sector, especially in the West, we need to rediscover what I describe as profit with purpose. In the world of high finance, for much of my professional life, a lot of international business appears to be profit for the purpose of profit, which is great. Making a lot of money is great because that's what generates wealth. But we have to make sure that societal challenges can't just be regarded as the responsibility of other people, and have that at the center of allowing and supporting our policymakers to think more inclusively of what economists describe as externalities, and internalizing them to be part of regular thinking. And that goes back to why a global health and finance board is so powerfully needed, which, by the way, is not that different than what we need, of course, to tackle climate change.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, on the climate change, I mean, we had, China, US actually issued a joint statement there. So it shows that you can be collaborating and take some lead on those two big countries.
Sorry, Henry. One other important point I meant to mention very quickly is when I discussed this with an astute Chinese observer recently, when I was bemoaning the fact that I didn't think China was enthusiastic yet for this idea as I hoped. This person pointed out that so far in the brief history of the Financial Stability Board, every leader, the four leaders of the FSB, have all come from G7 countries. And therefore, going back to our earlier points, if you really want to create a new body that is truly shared by G20 members and inclusive of emerging countries, a very sensible thing from Western countries is to consciously, deliberately encourage a leadership position in terms of a president or chair from an important emerging country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is again visionary, and then you are really champion for the BRICS countries. You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, China is doing quite a lot. I mean, since the pandemic, China has pledged President Xi actually pledged $2 billion to developing countries. I know that President Biden pledged another $2 billion at the G7 summit, and President Xi pledged again another $2 billion in another. So I'm glad to see that kind of a healthy competition. But also, China has donated almost 2 billion doses of vaccine. And just this week, President Xi announced at the FOCA, China-Africa Summit, China has donated another billion, and also including joint production of another billion vaccine to African countries. So China actually does a lot already. And you're absolutely right. If those financial board or the healthy board and is vacant for China, and then it's not really letting China play some active role there, it's not fair. I mean, that's the problem. I think when you have this international mechanism in discussion, China is always on the side and not really playing some active role. But actually, I think the China actually does a lot already, and we should group into that and have a healthy cooperation on that. So talk about this cooperation. I mean, Leslie, I want to come to you now. You know that, and also this week, I mean, EU President and Chair announced, European is providing 35 billion euros on the EU gateway. I mean, on the infrastructure, just these 2 days. And of course, President Biden, passed a law about 1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and G7 also proposed Build Back Better World, B3W. And of course, this is the 8th year of China doing the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So infrastructure is really, I can see that as the largest largest common denominator and attraction for the world for the next 7 decades, probably, that we can still working on for many developing countries, and maybe another new, I'm not saying Marshall Plan, but maybe a global stimulating plan for the world to work together, rather than we're getting into this kind of geopolitical fight and argument. So what do you think? I mean, as a banker, development bank, the infrastructure, the opportunity in the developing countries for BRICS countries, for US, EU, other Western countries, what are what can be done for those things, and what's your assessment?
Thanks, Andrew. I think firstly, the recent pronouncements in a lead up to COP26 is a clear indication, and because of all the announcements you've just made reference to, it is going to be, I think, a period of renaissance for development banks because of the significant new focus on sustainable infrastructure. There is so much new financing needed to replenish existing infrastructure and to build new infrastructure that is resilient and sustainable. So I think one of the first key points to make in this regard, and Jim already touched on it, is that traditionally people have always looked at infrastructure as hard economic infrastructure in terms of ports, airports, high-speed rail, and so on, power infrastructure. But social infrastructure is also now becoming very, very critical. Jim just mentioned the commission that he was part of, which looks at health and sustainable development in the European Union. And within multilateral banks, we are also now placing huge emphasis on that component. Coming back to infrastructure, I think one of the biggest significant developments here in China is the increasing focus now on greening the Belt and Road. And in fact, I'm hoping that many people hope that maybe the words will be used, green Belt and Road, and not just making reference to try to green the Belt and Road, because that will send a very powerful signal. And China's already done this to a degree, if you like, with the announcement that it will no longer finance coal-fired power outside of China. As you know, the announcement was made in the build-up before COP. So infrastructure can play a very critical role going forward towards greater sustainable development. But there's one other point I wanted to make, which is also very critical, Henry, and that is that our institutions that we have right now are not necessarily fit for purpose for the new realities that we are confronted with. Jim made reference to what he called externalities because of there's obviously the pandemic that we just lived through. There's climate change. There's a whole range of other issues that are transnational, that cross borders, or spillovers, as it is often called. And our institutions are not necessarily suited to deal with these. This might be a moment to go back to ask the questions whether we in fact have the right institutions in place, and whether we should reform some, innovate, in order to make sure we can tackle these new challenges that we are confronted with. But the last point I want to make is that the biggest potential, game-changing potential for the infrastructure is mobilizing capital from the private sector. As you know, Jim, public sector is very constrained fiscally. Multilateral banks have capital adequacy limitations. The biggest pools of capital is out there in institutional, in terms of the pools of savings, are in private hands. We need to find a way to de-risk infrastructure in such a way that we can make it attractive for these institutional investors to invest in sustainable infrastructure. And a lot of that is being done at the moment. And I think we're going to see a significant movement towards crowding in private sector capital in the next 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, there's many things. I agree. Social infrastructure is also very important. Health system, financial system, and of course now we're talking about hard infrastructure, where I think all the world I think we're on a consensus now. The world needs infrastructure. I mean, from US, EU, China. China probably does the best now. The total length of the speed railway in China is equal to the next 10 countries combined. Probably where the US military budget is equal to the next 10 countries combined. Maybe we should spend more on the infrastructure worldwide.